Okay. Before we get started with questions here, I would like to introduce our two panelists and give them a chance to have an initial reaction to the film, and then we will open it up for questions. First, Dr. Ryan Klataske is a cultural anthropologist and conservationist whose work focuses on wildlife conservation, natural resource management, hunting, tourism, ranching, and rural life in southern Africa and the Great Plains. He has conducted long-term ethnographic research with groups of private landowners and communities in Namibia who are working to manage and conserve wildlife in innovative ways. His research also addresses trophy hunting and its connection to conservation, land use, and rural livelihoods in Africa. Dr. Klataske teaches at Kansas State University and works with Audubon of Kansas and drove to Omaha today to be with us here tonight. Jocelyn Nickerson is a fourth-generation Nebraskan and holds a bachelor's degree in aviation and a master's in public administration from the University of Nebraska at Omaha. She has held grant writing and graphic design positions for the NASA Nebraska Space Grant Program and development and fundraising positions for the Animal Legal Defense Fund. Upon joining the Humane Society of the United States in 2010, she promptly created the Nebraska Rescue Council to promote pet adoption through shelters, engage on legislative issues, and build a network of support for deployment during emergencies. Jocelyn is a registered lobbyist and fights for increased protection for all animals through legislative action. We're really glad that you guys are both here with us tonight. Thank you for being here. Do you want to start by giving us an initial reaction to the film? Jocelyn, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I had not seen this film before tonight. I think it was impactful. I think it definitely hits on some of the issues that we're seeing at the Humane Society of the United States for trophy hunting. It is one of our pillars, and by that I mean one of our objectives for the next 5 to 10 years to end trophy hunting in the world, globally. So, but I think they did it in a very professional way, a diplomatic way. I really liked the way the film showed both sides. Yeah.
Well, first I'll just start by saying that I'm not here as an advocate for trophy hunting. I'm just here to share my experience and knowledge based on my research in Southern Africa. But I think that, and also that I think this is a really important conversation to have. And I think that one of my takeaways from the film is that there's really a growing global passion for African wildlife and conservation. And I think we see that in the global debate around this issue and the fact that you're all here tonight. And I think we need more concern for African wildlife and African people as well. And we also need more attention to conservation and human impacts on our environment in general, because as Laura mentioned, we are facing a crisis of mass extinction around the globe. We know that African wildlife face a number of unprecedented and urgent threats, including habitat loss and fragmentation, and human-wildlife conflict, and illegal trade and trafficking, as you see in this film. And I think one of the other takeaway messages from this film is that this issue is incredibly complex. We just learn about so many different things in this film, from trophy hunting and breeding and poaching and anti-poaching and trafficking. So this issue is incredibly complex. It also sits at the intersection of biological and ecological and social and cultural and economic and political issues. And that makes it really difficult to find the answers to the big questions we have to ask. Yeah, I have quite a few things I've been thinking about. I think about this a lot, but maybe I should just stop talking for a minute. But,
I would like, does anybody have a question yet at this time? Is there a specific theme maybe in the film that resonated with you? Or is there a person that you related to or didn't relate to in the film? Is there anybody in the audience that wants to?
One of my favorite lines was one of the protesters who goes, "How do you know that that money is going to conservation?" Because that's something I ask. I'm a fan of a lot of like National Geographic photographers and conservation, and that's one thing I always say is like, prove to me that this money isn't going to some politician's pocket or going to, you know, it says it's going to conservation, but then they're saying, well, I'm paying my men so that people could come over here and hunt them, and it's, you know, that was one of my favorite lines from it, because that's something I want to know. I kind of wish that it would have touched where the money went, like how it's going to conservation. Like locally, I know like hunters that go after deer and stuff, like that money goes towards like the duck conservation or the stamp or something like that. I know that, but over there you don't know because, am I making sense?
Yeah,
Am I babbling?
absolutely. I think this is one of the first questions when Ryan and I engaged one evening on this topic. It was one of the first questions I asked him with his experience in Africa. How do we know that the money is going to conservation? And do you have a comment on that?
Well, the good thing is that there's actually a lot of research on this topic, and so there's a lot of evidence and a lot of data, and lots of people from different disciplines looking at this and documenting it. And so, if anybody's interested in like learning more about that research, I'd be happy to provide a bibliography or point you in directions of specific scholars who are writing about this. And so there is evidence. And also many documented case studies that show when money does go to communities or does go to benefit conservation. I think there's also lots of examples when it doesn't, and so we have evidence that in both type of situations. My research in Namibia focuses on private landowners who are primarily ranchers, who have worked together to form these partnerships called conservancies. And Namibia is a really interesting case study around conservation and hunting, because in the early 1900s, just as in the Great Plains, for example, wildlife was wiped out from from the savannas of Namibia as colonial settlement and agricultural expansion moved in. And wildlife were decimated. Wildlife populations were decimated throughout Namibia. And so the government started to institute bans on hunting, both trophy hunting and commercial hunting, and as well as subsistence hunting, and started to have all kinds of control measures. This is the same time we see the development of colonial era national parks. But none of these things really stopped the killing of wildlife. So around the 1960s and 70s, a number of conservationists and other people started to think about things differently. And there was a number of policy changes in Namibia, as well as other countries in Southern Africa, which were really unique in terms of globally, by basically giving ownership and control over certain game species to landowners. And so this led to a situation where landowners all of a sudden had an incentive to conserve wildlife on their land. And so landowners started to see things differently. They started to see this value in the wildlife. And so at one point, landowners, during my research, would often talk about how they would basically exterminate all herbivores on their ranch land, because they saw these herbivores as competition for cattle. And they saw predators as threats to their livestock. Well, these policy changes started to lead to changes in the way that people relate to wildlife. And this led to drastic increases in wildlife populations throughout Namibia. So now you have these ranch lands, kind of like here in Nebraska or Kansas, but they're just teeming with wildlife. And in many ways, this has been a result of these policy changes. And now landowners are working together to find ways to manage and conserve free roaming wildlife across the boundaries of private land. And sometimes this means taking down fences, and it means finding ways to work together. So that's basically what my research shows. And there's other examples in Namibia where you have whole communities over large areas of land, where also they have now been given rights to benefit from the wildlife on their land. And this has also led to drastic increases in wildlife populations.
Does Namibia now allow hunting or trophy hunting that those funds would go back to those communities? Is that?
Yeah, and so these communities and landowners then can benefit from trophy hunting is one way, or through other types of ecotourism. as well as meat production and other types of wildlife-based land uses. So Namibia is actually a really well-studied and documented case study of how the money from hunting and other types of tourism go back to local communities. And so in some of these poor communal areas, like you saw in the film, hunting and tourism are helping to fund conservation efforts and wildlife management efforts, and they're helping to compensate local people for human-wildlife conflict, paying for schools and development projects. And so, yeah, we have a lot of evidence to show it's working in Namibia at least. But there's also, like I said, many case studies of places where it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Jocelyn, did you have anything on that original question? The original question was being worried about whether the funds actually go to conservation efforts, and how we know that.
So in the same vein of I think it was the same guy that you had talked about. He said, "Why don't you just give the money to the school?" And that's kind of my whole point. And I think HSUS's whole point is just give the money to the school.
Yeah, and that's a good point. The problem is it doesn't happen. Like, where's the money coming from? Yeah. And I think, a lot of people would probably agree with that, but it's just not happening. That's just not the reality. And we have to find ways for people to contribute to conservation who may not be hunters. And, trophy hunting, in my opinion, or based on my experience and evidence I've seen, has the potential, under certain conditions, if well managed, to contribute to conservation in certain circumstances. But it's still a flawed system, and there's shortcomings and limitations, and it's also not enough funding to fund the vast amount of conservation efforts that need to take place in Africa. And so we actually have to think about radically different solutions too, and figure out how to get people to pay for conservation in other ways.
So ecotourism, so that's wildlife watching, photography, that sort of thing, is $17 billion, and trophy hunting is just 1% of that. So I kind of want to know where's the ecotourism money going? If it's not going, is it all, that also going to the pockets, the profits? So yeah, it's a flawed system.
One of the things that I noted when I was watching this is at the auction when they were selling breeding stock, and one antelope went for $2.7 million. And so then you wonder, the money that comes in from trophy hunting or ecotourism, how much of that is going into a capitalist system, right? So if they have $2.7 million to spend on a single breeding animal, how much of this is going to conservation and how much of it is going into somebody's pocket? And that feeds back to that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that, we can look at trophy hunting as one tool in our toolbox, and we need to diversify that toolbox and increase the number of tools we have for conservation. And ecotourism is also one tool. There's also problems with ecotourism. One problem is that tourism doesn't take place everywhere. It doesn't function everywhere. For example, in many places in rural Africa, there's just not tourist infrastructure, or you really have to have this combination of the right type of wildlife, the right infrastructure, the right human resources, the right training. You have to have low political risk. Tourist markets are often really fickle, and a hot spot today might change. So it doesn't always provide a reliable stream of income. For example, tourism to Kenya dropped significantly after the Ebola crisis in West Africa, even though it's thousands of miles away. And so you have issues like this. And also there's many people in Africa who just don't have the capital to invest in some sort of big game lodge or the tourist infrastructure to hire people and provide all of the things that tourists need. And then you have the question of, I guess my point is that it just doesn't function everywhere. And oftentimes, trophy hunters, for example, will travel to places that tourists won't go. So in Zimbabwe, for example, during times of political unrest, trophy hunters would still go to these areas, and that money would still go to these communities. But you're not going to have tourists go into these areas.
Do we have any more questions right now from the audience or comments?
As you mentioned, it is a complex issue, and as Mr. Hume mentioned in there, it's not just the animals, it's us. It's the whole system. The one hunter, unless I'm grossly mistaken, he perverted part of the scriptures, because God did give us dominion over creation, but not to do with as we please, but to take care of it and make sure that everything operates in a good fashion. And as an Eagle Scout and a former Order of the Arrow member, if that means anything to anybody, conservation has been something near and dear to my heart for a long time. And we're not going to solve it overnight. Right now at Dundee, there's another movie, The Biggest Little Farm. It's just been extended for another week. And it deals in a similar fashion with the whole ecosystem and how they took something that was dead and turned it into something that was producing. And they're working with nature. And they're not just going in and killing a bug with pesticides or shooting the predators. They found out that it all works together, the predators and everything else. And it's a learning process as well. And it's something that the whole world needs to take a bigger grasp of, because it's not localized just to Africa either. It is a worldwide global problem. You have problems with the pandas and the snow leopards and almost any creature you want to pick worldwide. We need to learn to function. Trophy hunting for the sake of a trophy, I'm not real big on that notion. Not to say that it should necessarily be done away with, but it should maybe be controlled in a fashion where, something that's not usable or very little use, like the head, and take the rest and put it to functional use, making coats or food or what have you. It's like the American Indians. When they killed the buffalo, they didn't kill it as a trophy. They used literally every single piece of that animal to exist and survive. It was food, it was clothing, it was coverings, part of their tents, it was tools, it made needles and arrows and you name it.
Reactions to comments? I think we're all up here nodding at your comments. Ryan?
Yeah, well, you mentioned that you don't necessarily agree with trophy hunting, and that's actually what what I think is interesting about the people who made this film, the producers of this film. They basically set out to make a film that was an expose of trophy hunting, and I think when they began to research it and carry out the filming process, they started to realize that it wasn't just black and white, and it wasn't as simple as they thought, and that solutions or like banning trophy hunting aren't just they have complex repercussions. And so I think in many ways they set out to really shame the industry, but realize it was much more complex. And I also read an interesting quote by one of the filmmakers that they got to know this hunter, the main protagonist. What's his name? Philip. Yeah. And they can get along with. Sorry, but they still don't really understand his motives. They still don't really understand what drives him. And the quote that I read was that he's a lunatic, and they see him as a lunatic, but they also came to realize that maybe this lunatic actually contributes to conservation, and that raises a really challenging question for them. So I think that's interesting.
That is a really interesting quote. One of the things that struck me as being gray was how do you feel and how does everybody feel about these South African courts saying, okay, now you can sell your rhino horn, right? Because for a lot of conservationists, for a lot of animal people, we say, no way, you can't do that. But for him to save the rhinos that he's saving, he needed to sell that rhino horn. So did it change anybody's opinion? Does anybody have any comment on that? Up there, maybe.
For people that don't know me, I am the rescue and rehab coordinator for Nebraska Wildlife. And I was really kind of stuck on the rhino horn thing also. I see his point. I see his point of I have these thousands of rhinos that wouldn't be here if I wasn't taking their horns so that they can't be poached. But from a conservation point in what we do, those animals are being bred in captivity, and they are on thousands of acres, I'm sure. However, they're not living the natural life that they would be living, nor would they be able to just be released into that natural life after living a life of captivity. And so while I understand his preservation of the animal and wanting to keep it for future generations, I also don't find it to be a fair resolution on the issue.
So I was actually going to kind of bring up that point as well, especially with where you see the scenes of the crocodiles, like in the pits, or the lion raising farm. And then one of the farmers also at one point brought up something about how you have these animals for breeding, and then eventually he'll turn them loose to be hunted. So it kind of brings up an ethical question for me, and I think it was kind of a theme with the film. What is the ethics here? Is it better to keep these animals in what could be questionable welfare? I mean, we didn't really touch on that. What quality of life do these animals have in this situation? And then I think also the question that I wanted to ask you guys too was kind of your opinions on the theme that I felt was going on, the ethics of, is it a greater good situation? Is it you're driving the bus down the street and do you swerve to hit one person or, keep going and hit 5 people? I mean, there's just this ethical question here, I think that is prevalent throughout the film, and I was interested in hearing your opinions on that.
Well, the Humane Society of the United States is absolutely opposed to canned hunting, so I can't justify any of that.
Can you make a minor distinction between canned hunting
yes.
and trophy hunting? Trophy hunting could be in the wild, right? Versus canned.
Trophy hunting could be in
could
the
you
wild.
define canned
Yes,
hunting?
yes, yes. So canned hunting is either the breeding that you saw, and then they place the animal in the wild, or they just let you shoot them in the fence, inside the fence. And we are also against internet hunting. So that is you pull the trigger from your computer and they kill the animal on the ranch or whatever. Yeah, so we're against that. I hope you are too.
Yeah, I'm definitely not supportive of canned hunting either. And I actually there's many hunters, at least people in the hunting community that I've met in Southern Africa who are also very strongly opposed to canned hunting. And there's many people within the hunting industry who are working really hard to oppose canned hunting and other types of hunting like this, and sort of drop and shoot type of hunting. And there's a lot of effort right now and a number of calls to really strengthen sort of regulations of how we actually carry out these practices, and what are the best practices, and how we can regulate it, and how we can make them better. Because what we know is that trophy hunting is best when it's well managed, and when it's not well managed, that's when we start to see problems like canned hunting. In terms of the rhinos, so one alternative way of looking at it is that if you provide, for example, thousands of acres of habitat for rhinos in John Hume's case, you're also providing thousands of acres of habitat for other species that have an opportunity to benefit as well. And if it wasn't for those rhinos, he would likely be raising cattle. And if he's raising cattle, he's less likely to be tolerant of all wildlife, including rhinos and other herbivores and predators. And that is really one of the main benefits of situations like this, is that oftentimes by having revenue or incentives from hunting to then conserve even one or two or a number of species for hunting, it then often provides habitat for many other species, and that's what we see in Namibia on these ranch lands. The point about sort of driving down the road and making this ethical decision, this is something I've thought a lot about, because I've also thought a lot about like where is the disconnect and how can we have more communication and collaboration between people who are sort of on the extreme ends of this debate, and what's the real issue that keeps their sort of logical frameworks apart. And I think it really comes down to this issue of a focus on an individual animal versus sort of a species or habitat conservation. And I think it often becomes really difficult to have conversations when if one person's focus is on the killing of an individual animal, while someone else's focus is on the conservation or preservation of the species in general or habitat. And I think that's sort of a point where somehow we can figure out ways to have better conversations around that issue. And that is somehow a bridge, I think, to a more conducive conversation.
Right. I agree. And I think it's one of the points of showing this film or doing education every day. I think we live in a world where people's opinions are polarized on either side. And so the more that we can come together here in the center, that definitely will benefit conservation in the long run. I see you raising your hand over there.
We've got a question up here, and then we'll come down right here.
So I was kind of curious about the money, the financial going to the governments, or whose pocket that money goes into. Can you elaborate on that? Because I know from the governments, especially in Zimbabwe and South Africa recently, the presidents have been very corrupt. There was just a recent scandal with, I think it was Mbeki from South Africa. So to sit there and say this money is going to the community, how do you know? Who's keeping that? Is it a South African bureaucracy? Who is actually doing that research, and how do we know that they can be trusted?
So there's definitely many examples of corruption. And that's one of the big problems with this system. But it's also a problem with ecotourism and other types of solutions or tools. In Namibia, for example, money goes directly to conservancies. And a conservancy is this community partnership which is made possible by these policy changes, which is basically a community scale institution in which communities work together to benefit from wildlife. And so in Namibia, we have lots of evidence, and it's really clear to show how this money goes to these rural communities or to landowners. In other places, there's evidence to show that there's corruption is significantly influencing and impacting conservation in negative ways. It's much more difficult to study it's much more difficult to study the problems and the negatives than it is to study the solutions, the positives. So there's not, I think, a lot of research on corruption because it's difficult to study.
More difficult to study in areas that are corrupt.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
So it seems to me from watching this movie, one of the main factors in depleting these populations is poaching. And so I guess I'd like you to maybe talk about poaching. I mean, this movie is about trophy hunting, and a lot of the activism I see is about trophy hunting. And what are your thoughts about maybe the poaching piece of the puzzle is way far more messy? And so like talking about trophy hunting is like the trophy prize, when actually like the larger problem is the black market and poaching. And I guess I just would like to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, that poaching is a huge issue. I think so. In terms of the issue around banning hunting or banning the trade of wildlife products, we can see by comparing examples in different African countries that bans often result in increases in poaching and increases in this type of illegal trafficking. And Namibia, where I studied, is oftentimes compared to Kenya, because in Namibia they have this robust hunting and tourism economy where landowners and communities have rights to wildlife and can benefit from wildlife through hunting. In Kenya, they have banned hunting since the 1970s. And since that ban, we see like this spike in poaching and a depletion of Kenya's wildlife. Whereas in Namibia, we actually see generally the opposite. We see rises in wildlife populations, especially in areas outside of national parks and protected areas. And as you know, most wildlife in Africa is not in national parks and protected areas. And we also see that Namibia is dealing with poaching better than some places where we have bans on hunting and commercial trade in wildlife products. So that's one issue. And the other issue with trophy hunting is, or hunting in general, or giving communities and landowners rights to wildlife, is that if you give landowners rights to wildlife and they can benefit from them, then they have much more of an incentive to protect that wildlife from poachers. So on the lands where I live, on the ranches where I lived in Namibia, people are actively working to prevent those animals from being poached. And so oftentimes the commercial value of wildlife is a direct incentive to prevent poaching. And then it also, communities benefit from wildlife as well. So for example, on many of these ranches in Namibia, you have farm worker communities. And because of hunting and the provision of meat, these farm workers are then less likely to poach. And meat can be distributed to local communities, which then also decreases the pressure on wildlife from poaching. And that's another issue. The other issue related to poaching is that we see an increase in the militarization of anti-poaching efforts in Africa. And this is, as an anthropologist, we have to also talk about, I think we have to talk about people and local people and the experience of local communities. And one of the issues that we need to deal with is issues around human rights and violence against people related to conservation and related to anti-poaching. And oftentimes in Southern Africa, indigenous people and poor and marginalized people are often tortured or imprisoned, or there's bans on subsistence hunting, food sources are taken away. And so there's also this whole range of issues related to human rights that also needs to be addressed.
And I think that was part of the point that I wanted to make about poaching as well, is what are the root causes of poaching and how are we addressing human needs in order to minimize that? And so the idea, I think we see parallels in North America and the Western world as well about if we don't address basic human life needs, then it may lead to criminal activity, not just with wildlife, but in general. And so how do we as human beings address the needs of people in order to meet kind of our end goals of wildlife conservation or peaceful communities and those sorts of things? So I think that those are really important. They weren't really addressed here much, but I think they're important. No?
It also gets back to the complexity of the issue, because we have to look at this issue holistically, and we have to see the interconnections, and we have to be able to see small and see the fine-grained details. We also have to see big and see this from a global perspective. We have to be able to look at local perspectives, to consider local people, but we have to tie together all these different perspectives in order to have a way of really thinking about such a complex issue that ties together the history of colonialism and the impacts on local people and why people are poor to begin with, and how that ties in with this demand for global, illegal wildlife products. All these kind of things are so difficult to address, but that's why we can't just seek out simple solutions. We have to really consider the complexity.
I think that's a really great point. And living as a person in Nebraska, I think it's kind of hard to see that sometimes. Like, how do I make a global impact when I'm smack dab in the middle of the United States, where there is a lot of hunting, and there's mountain lion hunting in our own state. Like, how do I make my own global impact? So, Ryan, I'm curious, when you were in South Africa, like at Nebraska Wildlife Rehab, we focus on educating people when they call us about nuisance wildlife issues. I was wondering if you saw, because the film didn't really address this, they just kind of showed the anti-poachers going into the villages and threatening the villagers. So I was wondering what kind of education you saw in South Africa, if any, about living with wildlife and how to address nuisance wildlife issues, especially with farmers there.
Wildlife conflict.
So when I was doing my research, I worked quite a lot with the Cheetah Conservation Fund, and they are a prominent example of a conservation organization working directly on the ground in Namibia to deal with human-wildlife conflict. And so there's, I helped facilitate workshops to help train farmers on how to deal with conflict between livestock and cheetahs. And one of the innovative strategies they're using is to promote livestock guarding dogs. So they have, do we have that here too? Yeah.
Yeah, they do, and we've definitely in ranching in the West, people using Great Pyrenees, but we also work with a group called Working Dogs for Conservation, who train dogs as guardian dogs for African communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's lots of examples like this of where there's organizations and in conservancies. These conservancies are often the funds from hunting then go into conservation education projects and to help reduce this human wildlife conflict. That's a good question.
Got one more question over here.
Thank you for being here. It was excellent hearing you, but I got two-part question. To touch on the local part, what can I do just here in Omaha to help prevent trophy hunting or can hunting and stuff like that? And then what's the international community, like the European and Asian, what are they doing to, because they touched on the legal aspect of Americans going over to bring trophies back. Are there any other nations that are trying to push for that and just to ban it internationally?
I'm positive that other nations are entering Africa for trophies as well, but I will just touch on the local issue, and then maybe you can touch on the European issue. Vote. If you don't like the way that your state senator is voting on the mountain lion hunt, vote them out. If you don't like the way that the bills are going, come to me. I will help you write a bill, and we'll find a senator to carry it for you. That's how you change the laws in Nebraska, at least.
From my perspective and from the perspective of Nebraska Wildlife Rehab, is that education is the key to everything. From the individual wildlife issue where somebody has an issue with a raccoon in their yard, or how we feel about our hunting seasons and that sort of thing. But I think that extends, that works locally, but it also works internationally. So people would not be poaching for ivory or for rhino horn if there wasn't a market for it. And we're not going to change public opinion overnight about whether rhino horn actually has medicinal properties or not. But education and funding nonprofits who do the important work of education, either in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, or here in the United States, we can speak with our dollars, and we can speak with our voting, of course, locally. And those would be the things that I encourage people to do. We here in Nebraska have a lot of great conservation organizations doing work locally and internationally. And as far as Europe would go, I would say that you will see the same reaction in the countries that I'm most familiar with, like Germany and Austria, the same reaction to these topics that we see here in the United States. And they're doing the same type of work there.
I think we need to really be open-minded and think critically and try to consider the possibility for new and innovative approaches to conservation. I think we need to diversify our toolkit and increase the number of tools we have to conserve species, and realize that most of us, I think all of us here, have a similar end goal. We all want to see wildlife thrive. And I also think that we can learn from Africa, and we should try to educate ourselves about Africa and African issues. And one of the reasons why I went to Namibia in the first place to study these conservancies, these partnerships of ranchers, is to look for innovative ways that we can conserve wildlife and do things different here in the Great Plains. So I think one of the things we can all do is start to think more, not only globally and what we can do to, for example, save wildlife in Africa or wherever, but think about what we can do here to save prairie and to save prairie wildlife. We live in the Great Plains where prairie and prairie wildlife are vanishing rapidly. And I live in Manhattan, Kansas, which is in the heart of the Flint Hills. And the Flint Hills is one of the last areas of native tallgrass prairie. And all through the Great Plains, we see prairie vanishing and being converted to monoculture crops of soybeans and corn, and what drives that. So we have to think about incentives, and we have to think about revenue, and we have to think about what incentivizes people to conserve prairie and keep prairie wildlife, and to include wildlife within their ranching or farming systems. And so we have to think really creatively, I think, and also to realize that we're losing a lot of what we have here that's incredibly special.
Prairie and wetland ecosystems on the Great Plains are critically important. And actually, interestingly enough, sitting at this table, we had a partnership to work on prairie dog relocation last year, and it actually involved all of our organizations together, the Prairie Dog Coalition of the Humane Society of the United States, Nebraska Wildlife, Rehab, and Audubon of Kansas. And that's another way that you can get involved locally as we make those strides towards individual species conservation or land protection here on the Great Plains. We need public support, and we need people speaking out in favor of those projects, because we are all working for the same goal, no matter where we come from. And I also want the public to see that a group like Nebraska Wildlife Rehab or Audubon of Kansas or HSUS, we can work with Ducks Unlimited or the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, and we do, but we need to model that. We need to model that partnership, because people tune out the far left and the far right, or the two extremes of a position, particularly here in the Midwest, where we all like to be really practical, right? So it's only through coalition and partnership that we're going to make some change and make a difference for the things that are truly important to us.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Down here? Pat, down here? Way in the front.
Got it.
I think the panel just touched on this a little bit, but I've been waiting to ask, how do any of these practices compare to the simple future problem, and right now it's constantly happening, of just human population growth and encroachment on wild habitats, whether it's forest in South America or even in Africa for farmland? How does any of this even drastically compare to that issue, whether it's looming long term or even in the immediate near term?
Well, I think that speaks to what you were saying earlier about encroachment, climate change, human and wildlife conflict. It's very complex, and it's something that we need to continue to discuss, or we'll never solve. And and while I'm a lobbyist and can see things from the legislative side, we can't legislate our way out of everything, and so these difficult conversations have to continue.
I think what it highlights is the fact that there's not simple solutions. And for example, we can't just rely on national parks or protected areas in Africa, for example, to conserve wildlife, because most of the wildlife in Africa exists outside of national parks. And there's incredible pressures on national parks and protected areas. There's incredible pressures on land in general. So we have to figure out ways for people to live together with wildlife and to incentivize people to conserve wildlife on their land and integrate it into whatever type of economic and subsistence system they have. And that is the real challenge. And that kind of gets at the heart of hunting and the debate about conservation in general, in my opinion. Yeah.
Are we out of time? Just want to make sure.
You
that
guys
we're
want to
good.
do some final thoughts to leave us with?
Ryan, Jocelyn?
Thank
final
you for
thoughts?
inviting me. I really enjoyed watching the film. I'm looking forward to speaking about this at upcoming meetings. I think it's a great topic, great conversation starter, so thank you.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for being here. And feel free to get in touch with me if you'd like to discuss this more, or would like to see research or anything like this. I'd be happy to continue the conversation. So thank you.
Well, thank you both so much, and thank you again to Film Streams, and for all of you for coming tonight. I'm heartened to see people wanting to talk about this topic and any other related to conservation and wildlife in our community. You know, they're near and dear to us, but I think that they're critical to our survival as well, because we don't want to be on Earth without wildlife. And so thank you all for coming out tonight. Appreciate it.